I'm going to talk a bit about the grapes that we have in our backyard, and about the trellis system we set up, which works for us. We tried a couple of things. I guarantee you can find something better, but I'm going to explain what I did and the pros and cons of that. Now we have 4 grape vines here. So these over here are the green seedless Thompson grapes. We were just looking for something that was seedless, and we thought, why not try green and red? So we have 2 greens and we have 2 red. The red are the red Concords, also seedless. Now the greens, we never get as big of a yield on a green. This is actually looking to be the biggest yield we will have on the green. And I don't know if that's because of the variety. What I actually think it is the fact that these get afternoon shade where the red Concords are still in sun right now. And I think that hour or 2 difference of sunlight might be part of it as well. So I also did something in the fall that I'm finding is kind of stupid. We ran our backlights through the grapevines, but you get these that try to actually cling on, and that's what's going to help your grapevine support itself in the long run. But I just have to go through until we cut off the grapes, make sure I don't electrocute myself when I cut the grapes back, and make sure that the vines aren't cutting into the wire. So just the point of that is you need to make sure, plan ahead when you put your grapes in, because they're going to take up more space than you think. They do need a lot of sun. They need good airflow too. The airflow, it's important to, we cut back, like this year, we're cutting back more aggressive than we have. Any branch that doesn't have grapes on it that's sticking out, we're just cutting it off this year, because if it doesn't get good airflow and it doesn't get good light, your grapes aren't going to develop, or they're going to get mildewy. So airflow, light, plenty of space. All right, on a trellis, this is probably our 2nd or 3rd try. While the grapes were still young, we were trying to figure it out. But we went with a tree post. So we have a 2-inch tree post here that's 8, maybe 10 foot, I can't recall. I dug the hole super deep, so it probably is a 10-foot pole. It's just about 6 feet above ground. And then, I mean, I dug that hole as deep as I could, but I also poured a bag of concrete into each one. Now, this is what we ended up changing. We put rebar, and the reason being is the wood, it can crack if it gets too much weight. It will rot over time. There's just more maintenance needed with the wood. I tried cable. I couldn't get the cable tight enough to actually support them. So you can do a wood trellis system. Just keep in mind that with the constant water hitting them and other things, you're probably gonna have to replace that wood, and it gets harder to replace once your plants actually develop onto the trellis. Okay, so I got a smaller tree stake when I made the cross, what I call the T-joints. So I drilled a hole in there just big enough to fit this smaller metal stake in there. And then I rested the rebar on it and loosely secured it with wire. This wire is actually loose. That was probably used when I was originally training the vines. But then I rested on there. And honestly, it probably doesn't even need to be secured because it overhangs by 2 feet, but I have it loosely secured. We also, because we have kids running around all the time, we decided to make sure that we don't have something that's going to cause them to lose an eye. So we tried to put tennis balls or something on each one of these joints that sticks out. When we were originally putting in the trellis system and establishing our vines, I mean, they're really small vines, just what you get from the nursery, a small shoot coming out of a bucket. And we read that there's a couple different ways to go. I know some people will do the overhead so that the grapes hang down. There's a lot of different ways you can go with them, and I don't know that there's one that's right over the other. We went with the 2-tiered system, and I can't remember exactly the dimensions, but I read into it, and I think this is 32 inches or something, and 50, I don't know. But they're spaced out enough so that you can have vines up top and vines down below. So we have, well, right here, we have it trained up to come up. And then because that one's on the left and I kind of overcrowded these, I should have given them more space, but they do fine. The only thing is I can't let them grown to their full potential. I have to cut them back. But because I already have this one over here, I kept that one just going to the left. This one kind of goes both ways a little bit, more up and then a little bit out. But you want to have them, a main vine come up and then over to the left and over to the right, and then up and over to the left and over to the right. When I'm talking about the main vine, yours isn't going to look like this the first year. Yours is going to look like this the first year. But every year it's going to get bigger. This is probably a 5 or 6 year vine right here. In the fall, once the leaves go dead, we aggressively cut this back to nothing else but the woody stem that we want to keep. Everything else, this has already been thinned 3 times this spring and summer. The vines grow incredibly fast, and if anything, you're going to need to be cutting them back. So in the fall, I'll talk about this again, but I'll cut this one off, I'll cut this one off, I'll cut that one off. I'm basically going to cut everything off but the wood, because we already have our vines established in the patterns we want. If it wasn't an established vine, maybe I would decide that this is the one I was trying to train up here. And what I would do is, when I was first starting, is I would take some of these metal pieces and I'd loosely clip it in there so that it was on the rebar until these things attached it on its own. Now, one of the downsides with the rebar, I don't have the problem so much now that my plants are established. When they were first trying to get established, it was full sun. The leaves didn't really protect and cool it off very much, and the rebar got really hot, and it made it tough for these to want to hold on to it. It took a little longer. You wouldn't have that issue with wood, but with wood you may have to replace it after a couple years, whereas I won't have to replace these. Maybe this in another 4 or 5 years if it rots on the bottom. One thing you're gonna find that the grapes, they're never as big as the store. I mean, that's most produce that you grow. It's never like it is in the store. If you're doing organic, homegrown vegetables, sometimes you get them huge. But one thing with the grapes though, you don't need to thin out the bunches or prune them back like you might with an apricot or a peach tree. Whatever it's gonna grow, I found that my tree or my vine can support that just fine. What I am trying for the first time this year is we took every bunch about a week or 2 ago and we cut the bottom 10 to 20% of each bunch. And that's basically, so I cut off about that much on this one, about the same on this one, about an inch or 2 on most bunches. The hope, and what I've read, is that the extra energy is going to go to make these grapes larger. So we'll have fewer but larger grapes. The same method as why you would thin your peaches and your apricots. So one thing that we really strive for is we try to use no chemicals. Everything, I mean, I'm not 100% organic. There are times that I will use chemicals, but my kids eat these right off the vine. So I'm really careful about what I spray onto our grapes, on our tomatoes, on other things, because my kids are always eating them. And it's called a leaf skeletonizer. It's like a little tiny caterpillar that's yellow and black. And if you see those on your grapes, you need to nip them in the bud right away, because they're super invasive. They will take over in a very short amount of time, and they completely de-leaf the plant. They'll completely eat all the leaves off the plant, weaken and stress out the vines. We've had that issue in the past, and I still haven't found a good system to it, other than bribing and paying my kids to go pick off the caterpillars and the flies that lay the eggs as they see them. But we're gonna have that problem here in a couple of weeks. The good thing is, it doesn't tend to get out of control until after we harvest the grapes. So here we'll be harvesting the grapes probably in the beginning of July, the very end of June. And that's about the time where the leaf skeletonizer bug really takes over. Powdery mildew and some other types of fungus is another issue. A lot of the times you can solve that one by just creating good airflow and good sunlight. If it gets too much of the leaves, that's when you're gonna run the risk of getting fungus on the plants. It's the same thing with your tomatoes and other things. So I find that for myself, I actually treat both the green seedless Thompson and the red Concord over there that we have the same. I don't know if that's 100% correct, but it works. We have tried cutting off the bottom of both grapes this year to see if that makes for bigger fruit. We thin back the extra branches on both. We try to create the right amount of sunlight and airflow on both. We water them the same. As far as the watering goes on these, we actually put them just on a drip line. So whenever I have the garden irrigation going, these will also just drip on it. And it's a pretty slow flow that comes out of it, but they run for roughly 10 minutes and it's always been enough. We've never had an issue with not getting enough or overwatering, so I don't have much to say about that because we haven't had to deal with that, which leads me to believe that it's a pretty hardy plant with a pretty wide spectrum of tolerance, so long as it's getting regular water. And as far as watering, I would keep it right at the base there. Whenever you're gonna water a leaf, you run the risk of fungal attacks hitting that plant. I know we do that with our apricots, and I'm always a little nervous about it because we're trying to blast the aphids off in an organic way. But when I get the leaves wet and it's not a rainy day, there's the risk of fungal spores landing on the plant and then creating a fungal infection on the plant. And it's something we've run into in the past. So there's no point in watering down these. If our leaf skeletonizer bug gets out of control, sometimes we'll try to blast them off, just like you might blast off aphids off of your rose bush or your apricot tree or artichoke. But generally, as a rule of thumb, I try to avoid getting these wet. So I really was kind of concerned. Something I talked about earlier about you need to have the foresight when you put your grapevines in of what that vine is eventually going to take over. I put the chicken run here for practicality because their coop is over there and the place that they can dust bathe and feed is over here, and I had to connect them. In hindsight, I found out it was really good because in the summer they get full shade, in the winter they get full sun. But I was really worried about like these coming in there and the vine starting to take over into chicken wire and possibly ruining the chicken run that I have. But what I find is that the chickens are actually really good at taking care of that problem for me. Nothing seems to stick to it because they'll eat it before it gets to it. So if I do have low hanging grapes, if I do have low vines or leaves, the chickens will eat them, which I'm okay with. So that's basically our grapes for you. This has probably been my family's favorite. It's also one that's relatively low maintenance, and it's one of the ones that we're actually we jealously guard. We give a lot of the other produce away to the neighbors because we get too much of it, or it's something we like to grow, but we don't necessarily eat a ton of these grapes. We don't have that problem. We freeze them and it actually makes a great snack throughout the summer and fall for the kids. So we'll pick them, wash them, freeze them right away, which we'll do a video on that when we harvest them this year. If our harvest is like last year, I think we ended up with 30 pounds of Concord grapes and maybe 5 to 10 pounds of Thompson grapes. This year, I can tell you the Thompson is probably gonna be more. It looks like the red Concords are gonna be more as well. If you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the comments below, and we will see you next time.